At dawn the sea wore an old man's beard. Mist flowed in quiet drifts against the wharves of Oldtown, blunting rope and bollard into soft suggestion, swallowing the dark water where the honey wine met the whispering sound. Bells were already working at the fog, braiding the hour with thin bright threads of sound from a dozen steeples, all answered in their time by the deeper bronze voice of the starry sept. Above all, the Hightower's beacon fitfully glowed through the haze, a pale ember in a shroud of wool. A boy in novice's gray stood on an upper cloister of the citadel with a sheaf of rushes beneath his arm, waiting for Archmaester Quillen to finish his mutterings about gulls. He had been made to gather droppings from the ledges as penance for falling asleep in a lecture upon lineages. The ledges were slick with salt, and the gulls resented his broom. When he paused to rub a wrist, his eye lifted, and something in the fog lifted too. A shadow moved along the edge of the world. Not ship, he thought. Not barge, not a drift of cloud. It was absence, swallowing light. He stared until his eyes watered, and then he knew, because the city had been telling itself the story for weeks. Because a baker's boy had climbed onto a rack of cooling loaves to proclaim it. Because a hedge priest with wine-broken veins in his nose had mumbled it from a corner by the docks. "They are coming, Archmaester," the boy murmured, light-headed. "Archmaester, look." Quillen did not like to be told to look. He was old, and the chains at his throat were heavy. He cherished the world's facts in his mind, and had no appetite for its apparitions. He scowled, then indulged the boy and turned. Whatever he was going to say, dried up as the fog drew breath and peeled away like a curtain. The dragon came as a slow loom in the sky, each stroke of its wings a measured toll of power that laid up wind in its wake. It was not black, not truly, but the word people would use was black, because the eye loves simple lies. Its hide caught the seaborne light and put it out like wet thumb to candle. It seemed to abrade the dawn wherever it moved. Its rider was a shadow upon a hill of shadow, and when the beast banked and slanted nearer, Quillen made a small noise in his throat to find, after all, that he was mortal. Other shapes glided in the fog behind the first. One long and sinuous with a pearl sheen underneath, one shorter and heavier with bronze along the fringes of its wings. They fanned out as if the city were an orchard, and they the crows come to weigh it. The air smelled of brine and cold iron, and something else that set the teeth on edge. Hot stone, as if a mountain had turned in its sleep. Oldtown's days always began in tides. The tide of fishmongers, a tide of wine carts, tides of gossip. That morning the tides jammed. A woman carrying a pair of conchers dropped both and did not notice. A cohort of white-robed sisters from the starry sept, baskets hooked on their arms, looked up and crossed themselves with fingers still wet from morning ablutions. A barghee took his cap off, then his shirt, as if he might appease the beast by offering the only wealth at hand. When the dragons lowered, their shadows rolled over roofs and lanes, making a noon of the hour. On Battle Isle, the tower rose from foundations men said had been laid by giants or worse. Fused black stone cropped through the Hightower's pale courses in older places, slick and too smooth to take a mason's chisel. It felt cold even in summer. On the broad outer rookery, where banners snapped when there was wind and slumped when there was not, Lord Manfred Hightower stood beside a helmed guard and watched the first dragon turn its hillside body, sifting the fog with wingtips, and settle with elaborate weight upon the stone. The impact was felt all the way up. The old tower, used to wind and thunder in years, took it into itself with a shudder like a man receiving news. Lord Manfred was quiet. His hair was white, though he was not. Years had blanched it early and set a ring of care around his mouth. Behind him, the High Septon waited with the patience of a man schooled by silence. His crown of crystal and spun glass caught the light and sent it walking on every surface, as if 7 small suns had taken lodging upon his head. "Welcome them," said the High Septon gently. "Of course," Lord Manfred said, though he had employed half a dozen heralds to rehearse the words, and they fluttered out of him now with a surprising simplicity. "Of course." Balerion moved his head. He was not as large as the hill in a child's dream. He was not the size of a keep. He was only a thing like a ship, and that was enough. Those who had not seen him might have thought tales put more meat on his bones. Those who saw gathered to their hearts a clear, cold space and found in it the proper respect. His rider dismounted. The man's hair was dark and bound, a fall of ink across leather. He had a king's face without ornament, long and unsmiling, a little tired at the corners like a carver's workhorse tool, until he looked upon the Hightower and the High Septon, and then the face changed in a way difficult to name, something of patience, something of relief, something of a calculation set aside. "Lord Manfred Hightower," he said. "High Septon." The High Septon had seen him in his dream. This did not make him any less real. He lifted his palms and spread them, a gesture that made a chapel of air between them. "Aegon of House Targaryen, called the Conqueror," he intoned. But the formal words softened as if he were blessing a child. "You come as the day comes. Be welcome in Oldtown. I am seeking a place to set my burdens down," Aegon said. And those nearby thought it a pretty speech, because they could not see his mind at work, counting, weighing, measuring walls, windows, water, the mood in men's mouths. "I come to pay honor. I come to ask a thing." His sisters landed after him. Visenya's dragon dropped and folded like a thrown cloak. Visenya herself had put on mail because peace sits lightly for no one who has ever bled. She walked spare and straight, dark sister at her hip, pale hair braided to keep from the wind. Rhaenys touched stone with a different softness. There was a spill of curiosity in her posture. The way she looked over the sea's edges and into windows, as if the city were a book she meant to read cover to cover at once. Manfred Hightower went to meet them with a measured stride. He had dreamed in younger days of endings that came fast, of walls falling to sudden fire. But everything in him had been reshaped by time into the art of continuance. He was a steward by temperament. He kept things going. He bowed as he would to a storm one could not bar, and would need to live with afterward. "Oldtown is yours," he said, and the words were true with such odd resonance that he heard in them something more than courtesy. He heard a vow he had not meant to make until he said it. It was a morning of vows. In the cathedra of the starry sept, under the painted points of the firmament, the High Septon had dreamed the night Aegon came up out of sea and fog like a sun dark with its own light. He had dreamed of bread broken and wine shared and fire that did not devour. In the dream he had seen himself lift a crown toward a head that did not bow to take it, and the dream had been sweeter for that. No craven's play, but an anointing made between equals. When he looked now upon the Targaryen, he saw a man who might accept such an anointing without bending too far, and leave enough breath in the city to breathe. They did not go to the sept at once. A city is not only its sanctuaries, it is its middens and kitchens, its counting rooms and quays. Aegon walked first the rookery, where ravens shifted in their housings, knocking with beaks at the thin bars. He watched a dozen boys and 2 girls in the gray of novices hurry with bundles of reed pens toward the scribes' galleries. He put his hand to a wall where the fused black stone bled through, and it was cold even in the light. Visenya watched the men watching her. She watched the hands on hilts and hands on rosaries, weighed danger with the unconcern of a woman intimate with it. Rhaenys found a window where she could see the city's roofline and the water beyond and laughed. 2 notes, private and clean. At the foot of the tower they mounted horses and mules and were a procession. The streets opened like drawers to let them through. Oldtown showed its teeth and its bread. The sharp lean of wharf houses, their shutters hanging like eyelids, the sweet smoke corners where spiced wine was a loveliness against damp. The brown water pushed with poles where the honey wine ran thin. The white aprons of bakers glazed with flour. A man sold ink from vials strung on a cord around his neck. A girl spilt coins and scrambled after them with a gasp that turned to laughter as a stranger helped her gather them. Above, every so often, the dragons crossed, winged shadows combing the lanes. "Your city is old," Rhaenys said to Manfred, as they came along a bridge where swans made a procession of their own. "It smells of prayers and sugar syrup and damp books." "And tar and piss, princess," Manfred said dryly. "If you are to love it entire." "I love things entire," she said without heat. Visenya made no mention of love. She saw battlements, fall lines, choke points, alleys that would pin a company long enough for fire from above. She marked the Hightower's beacon and asked merely if it burned oil or whale fat, and when told oil, she nodded. Her finger smoothed a crease at her glove. It was the sort of thought one sharpened. Oil burns longer. Whale fat smokes? Smoke marks the sky for miles. Aegon asked questions about warehouses and granaries. He wanted to see the cellars where grain might sit sweet in a bad year. He wanted to stand on the quays where tall cogs shouldered in from the Reach and the Arbor and further, to learn how long a ship took up to be unloaded, and how many hands there were to do that work in winter. There is a conquest of the sword and a conquest of the tally stick. He knew both would be required if what he meant to make would endure longer than a man's lifetime. The citadel received him with dignity. 100 years of dignities carried in its gate. That morning it found a way to add another without bowing too far. Archmaester Quillen brought out 2 others to meet the new king. Archmaester Theomore with a chain heavy in rings of yellow gold and bright silver, for history and law, and Archmaester Velen with Valyrian steel at his throat among copper and iron, for his work with puzzles and the mind's trickery. Together, they were a syntax in human form. They listened as Aegon spoke his ask, and the conclave adjusted its breathing. For though they had suspected his wish, Oldtown had as many ears as a field of wheat. There is a difference in the sound it makes as rumor and as request. "I will need a seat," Aegon said simply. "A seat that is not a camp stool. I have raised a timber palisade by the Blackwater Rush and made do. But men come to measure and stay when your stone is older than their pride. My sister will keep an eyrie on Dragonstone, and in the east there are matters that are not finished, and in the west the rock men at Casterly Rock do not much enjoy being told what they are by water. I need a place that says this is a realm, and this is where it lives." "That is King's Landing," Theomore began reflexively, then bit the words and amended them. "Aegon's Landing, your..." He stopped again. It was hard to call a man "Your Grace" when you were trying to hear him clearly. Honorifics clawed the ear. It was a landing. It has become... Aegon's mouth sharpened. It will become something. A market, a garrison, a place to gather a fleet. But it is a camp that dreams of being a city. Oldtown is a city that has never stopped being what it is. If I set my bench in this hall, I will hear the realm more clearly for the wisdom at my elbow." Valen's eyes flicked toward the Hightower Lord. "Wisdom has its own will. I am counting on it," Aegon said. "They put him where men are put when they do not yet rule a place, and are not strangers either. A hall with handsome windows and a hearth deep enough for a man to sit in and not touch both sides with feet and hands." He took off the black mantle he had worn aboard Balerion and stood in the light, as if he might learn something about it. Lord Manfred came to him there at last without the High Septon at his side, and for a time they did not speak. It is sometimes the best speech. "If you sat your bench here," Manfred said finally, "the Reach would make certain you did not sit hungry. You would eat fruit out of season and fish before the chill, and the granaries would not turn to dust if a foolish wind blew from the west. That is not nothing, even to a king, but it is not everything. A capital is not only the buying and selling of things. Otherwise it is but a thick market with godlier pretensions. Otherwise it is but a..." "I do not need a godlier market," Aegon agreed. "I need a place hard to burn and easy to withstand. A place that keeps continuity as a habit, the way some men keep hounds. You have done that, your house. You keep. I need keeping. Memdrawen." He turned then, and the planes of his face altered once more. Only a little, but enough that Manfred found himself standing straighter, because someone had recognized a use he had not thought to name as virtue. "House Hightower," Aegon said, "will be my stewards." The word the king chose had a Reach cadence to it. It shot back and forth in Manfred's mind like a shuttle. Steward is a good word. It is a servant's word with a crown hidden in the grain. He tasted it. "Your hand is your right arm," Aegon went on, careful and clean. "One man, one will, my blood, and the sword that will hold my place when I am at war. The steward I ask for is not that. I ask for the house rather than the man. Steward is keeper, of stores of the city's peace when my banners are far afield, of the lighthouse of the realm. It will be work that does not end, and for it you will be near a fire that burns longer than a man." Manfred said nothing for a long space. Words come heavy and slow when they are being fitted for a year's wear. Rhaenys, watching from a cushion by the hearth, saw the moment seal. Not when he smiled and nodded graciously, and said he would be honored, but when his eyes moved from the king's face to the window, to the bright beat of the honey wine and back. He looked to see if the city could bear this, and he looked to see if the city could do without it, and then he looked at the king again and allowed himself to be altered by what he knew. He bowed. "We keep," he said. "We will keep." The High Septon crowned him there by the river, that afternoon with oil that smelled of roses and spice. To be anointed under the dome of the starry sept is to stand under a sky made by hands to remind you of the sky made by God. It is a lesson men understand differently when they come in wearing mail, and when they come wearing old cloth and sorrow. Aegon came in that day in black and steel, and bent, and the High Septon's hands were light, and it was not submission, and not defiance, and not merely politics. It is a hard thing to say what a sacrament is. The oil fell, and ran, and was caught in a cloth. A dragon turned his head beyond the walls, and the sunlight moved. The city breathed as if it had been holding breath for weeks. After, bread and salt were eaten on the steps and jugs of small beer, passed to hands still smelling of rope. A woman with her hair tucked into a knit cap put her child up to see the new king, and the child looked solemnly, and then put a thumb in his mouth. A harp spoke in a quiet corner, and Rhaenys, hearing it, moved toward the sound as if toward a friend. Visenya left the sept at once, and went back to the tower to walk the parapets. She stopped a guard and asked where their bolts were kept. When he showed her their housings, she asked, offhand as a housewife asking whether the bread was proofing, if the strings were waxed. He answered with pride. She nodded. It was not that she meant to teach the Hightowers their trade. It was that she could not live a day without thinking how a single day might break, and whether she could keep breath in it against breaking. Orys Baratheon arrived 2 days later, with 300 stormen, and a grin that was in some mouths a challenge, and in his was good company. He had been made hand in the years when the conquest was a thing done with teeth, and he bore the honor as a man bears a well-made axe. Not lightly, not heavily, with useful familiarity. When he saw the dragons riding the air along the river, he snorted. "Maesters and septons," he said to Aegon, drawing him away from the table where a dozen learned men were making a new alphabet from the realm's wants, the mother's city and the conclave's house. "Are you sure?" "Now. I am tired of tents," Aegon said, and Orys laughed and clapped him on the back as if he had made a jest, though his eyes were measuring like a carpenter's. "Jams, thresholds, stone, men. It will make the Tyrol boy sweat," Orys went on cheerfully in an undertone. "Lord Paramount 2 days ago. Gods, the ink is hardly dry, and now you take a Hightower and hang him in his sky. There are fields everywhere in this city. Fields of pride. Watch where you put your foot." "Bay." "I am watching," Aegon said, and thought also of Casterly Rock's pride, of Winterfell's silent regard, of the Eyrie like a thought held in ice, of the Mander flowing fat and green through villages with names that taste like bread. He thought too of Dorne. There is a kind of caution that is not fear. It is the caution of the builder who knows where the roof will be heaviest. They set about the business of staying. That work looks like ceremony from a distance and like lists up close. Manfred Hightower met with Aegon at a long table under windows that made light into a kind of doctrine. The first days were a catechism of bread and brick. The steward describing granaries, and the king asking what could be moved by river. The hand sketching on scrap how many men could be quartered in the casemates, and how many would be better sent out to farm, then called back by law when the horn blew. When the horn blew, Visenya brought in a roll of parchments of her own and laid it down with a thump that made the ink wells tremble. "There is no point to keeping a capital you cannot defend," she said, "and no defense that is only dragonfire and a prayer." Her map was a vulnerability turned inside out and made into architecture. She wanted a system of horns along the Honeywine, each tuned to a different alarm. She wanted stores of pitch in places where they would not be struck by a draft and turned to death for the men who had carefully stacked them. She wanted a small, ugly keep built upon the very black foundations within the Hightower's walls, where the stone was Hightower's walls, where the stone was wrong to the hand, where no mason liked to go. "I do not trust that old blackness," she said, "but I trust men less. If you do not make that place yours, someone will make it theirs for you." She wanted a trained corps of rivermen, not mere oars, who could turn a boat upon itself in a narrow channel and fight with hooks. Rhaenys brought a different list, a delicate one written in a hand that leaned rightward. Names of singers, names of storytellers, names of cooks who made almond tarts that tasted of orange blossoms, names of surgeons rumored to be deft with whetstone and thread. "If we are to make a court," she said to Aegon that night when they had slipped free of others' eyes for a time, and stood on a balcony where the Hightower's wardens had pulled back a hanging to let the air through, "let it be one that keeps people. Not only men who carry words like spears, but women with clean fingers and quick hearts, and small, bright things that make men love the place where they stand long enough to growl." She tipped her head so her hair slid and put her shoulder where his arm could find it without affecting, exactly, to lean. Oris, who liked to laugh at some things because laughter takes the splinter out of a sore, took Aegon down to the quay at night, when the wine-sinks were brave with little lamps, and said, "Listen." There were the small voices of fishermen, the sailors' oaths that make a song of blasphemy, the hum of a city's unimportant matters. "Can you stomach this?" he asked. "Can you live in a place that will ask you every morning and every night to count its trifles?" Aegon looked over the black water and thought of Balerions back under him, the familiar gearing of muscle and wing that made the world simple. "I am tired of the places where I forget we are making a country," he said. "Here I will remember." The first envoys arrived with rain on their cloaks. Harlan Tyrell, a man who had looked in a mirror that morning and adjusted a line here and there, but left the small nick where his barber had a slip, as if to say, "I do not mind small real things," came with 2 sons and a hunting hawk that hated the air in Oldtown because it smelled not of fields but of brine. He bowed low enough to be seen to have bowed, and not so low that his neck hurt, and when he rose, his eyes went to Lord Manfred with a smile that acknowledged old ties, and to Aegon with a smile that put out a hand and counted the fingers afterward. "My liege," he said, careful, making the word easy, "the Mander will be a highway to your heart, if your heart is here." He had brought pears as fat as fists and a cask of arbor gold, and Aegon accepted both with thanks and watched him the way a cat watches the corner of a room where a mouse lives. Harlan Tyrell knew something about making a place and keeping it. It is not only the Hightowers who are stewards by nature, but there are men who build storehouse upon storehouse, and others who build the habit of bringing it all to the right place in the right hour. The Hightowers had a river and a tower. The Tyrells had fields and a web of men who owed them harvests in their bones. Aegon saw the room between those sentences and made a place for both. From the north came Lord Torrhen Stark, not king any longer, though Winterfell still held him within its grey fidelity, as if nothing had altered. He had the look of a man who made up his mind in snow and kept it in fog. When he set foot in Oldtown, he did not sneer. He looked, and he put the smell of salt with other smells in his head, and he brought with him a son who could not stop looking at the dragons. They saw one together on a day when rain fell in a way that drew out the stone's darker vein, and Torrhen said to his boy in a voice pitched so as not to insult the men near enough to hear, "We bend to what makes sense. See that you keep our sense your whole life." Dorne's answer was slower and quicker at once. Words travel across borders at their own speed. Princess Myrria sat in Sunspear, under an awning striped blue and white, not because she feared the sun, she had tolerated it longer than most of the men who opposed her, but because the colors set off the pearls at her wrist. A girl with sand in her hair and a too serious expression spoke soft as a cat. "He has put his rear in Oldtown's lap." Myrria's laugh was old. "It is one lap. A throne is made of laps if you are honest. He will find the sharp bones in this one too when he moves." She did not send an envoy. She sent a gift, a pair of limes in a small wooden box, with a ribbon the color of sunrise around them, and a note that said only, "We furnish you these that you might think of thirst." The limes traveled by river and by road, and reached Aegon's hand green and perfect, and Orys, looking at them, whistled once. "She has a tongue." Visenya put the limes under her knife, and the smell filled the hall where the men were arguing over the price of salt in a bad year. For a moment, everyone grew very quiet. And then people found they were smiling, as if they had been caught doing something shameful and forgiven. Rhaenys put a drop of the juice on her tongue and closed her eyes. "The world is very large," she said, almost to herself. The weeks braided themselves into the kind of time that is neither feast nor famine, but the eating in between. The dragons learned the city's thermals and lazily drew loops over the river in the hour after the sun made itself honest. The Hightower's beacon kept its appointed fire. But now men saw up there, sometimes, a woman with white hair speaking with a guard about the shape of the wind. Orys took a company out to the west to look at a place where the road could be turned at a shallow angle, and an inn built big enough to swallow 50 soldiers, and return them in the morning, not entirely melancholy. Aegon wrote a letter himself in his own hand of thick strokes to Casterly Rock, a letter in which he did not bother with honey, and did not trouble to insult, either, but reported something like a weather. "We are here. It is cold when the wind moves along the honey wine and smells of bread when it does not. I expect your scion, a young archmaester, young only in the way anyone under 60 seems young to those above, brought before the king a bound sheaf of pages with the beginnings of a codex. If you mean to have stewards," he said, eyes darting toward Lord Manfred with professional respect, "define the work. Define it so that when Lord Manfred's grandson does something out of the way, your grandson has a rope to pull it straight again." His chain chimed softly. "We can write what we like. There is no law that prevents your will from becoming custom and your custom from becoming law, except time and stupidity. We are good for one and bad for the other." He took off his spectacles and wiped them with the same attention he gave to the river's level that morning. "Right," Aegon said. "Put in it that a steward's first work is to keep grain sweet. The second is to keep men honest about grain. If he breaks either trust, he will find he has nothing to bake and no hearth to bake it at." The codex grew in the way books grow, when the men writing them loved to fence each other, more than they loved the subject. The maesters argued in footnotes and in wet ink, and sometimes they came to the hall in a tired rage, and argued in front of the king, because the sound of the river made them suddenly friendly again. That is how institutions are made too. With heat and with the cold that comes when heat turns to something rounder. The court took on a different air than the timber fort by the Blackwater had kept. There were more pens here, more ink, and the air of the place took into it a smell of parchment and wine, and something like rosemary. It was not soft, though men soured by war sometimes called it soft to save themselves the work of learning new names for old dangers. The city had teeth, and it kept them clean. One evening, a fire broke on the Ender's Dock, where a pair of brothers in from Saltpans had stored pitch in a bad house. The flames went up with the low thump a man makes when he is struck entirely. The horns along the river cried, and men came in a walking rush with hooks and dips and a cart already loaded with sand barrels. Visenya arrived early and Rhaenys arrived later, and each did the work she loved without instruction. One set men where they could not trip over each other, and the other made a circle of frightened children into a game that kept their feet out of the way. When the fire had been beaten back into a sullen hiss, Aegon came and looked at the charred shape of the house, and said, "Tomorrow this will be a storehouse with a stone floor, and a law that says you may not sleep within 30 paces of fire. It is a particular kind of mercy to give men rules they can live by." Night fell differently in Oldtown than at the camp by the Blackwater. It came with a wash of bells, and then an hour later the bells again, and then the moon rose over the starry Sept's dome and turned it into a coin. Aegon, who had not thought much of moons before, learned them. He walked the Hightower's lower balcony with Rhaenys one night and said, "I find myself thinking of roofs." "You have always thought of roofs," she answered in the way she had, "that makes teasing sound like knowledge. Only before it was the roofs you might set afire, and now it is the roofs under which men will take their bread. The one kind of thinking is a child's needle. The other is a laundress, longer, stronger, and used every day." She leaned back on the parapet and looked up. A ship bell answered a bell ashore. The frogs began their thin fiddling somewhere in the reeds along a lower stretch of the river. "I do not know if men will love you for this," she went on. "They will call it dull. But they will be alive to do it, and perhaps even fat enough that their children live too. And perhaps that is better than love." "Bah! I would have both," Aegon said lightly, and she laughed and turned to kiss him at the corner of his mouth. The night made a small room around them, and for a little while there was no city at all. Only two people and a wind that smelled of river. A man died the next day for having his hand too deep in the dragon's purse. It is a thing that must be mentioned if one is to be honest about the founding of anything. The markets had always had men who counted slower when counting for others. They always will. But in the first season of a court new to a city old, some thefts are not trivial. Orys walked the man to the square and said plain as bread, "The king will be cheated like any man alive. But not now. Not by you. Not about grain." They took the hand. It was done with a cleanliness that suggested thought beforehand. The crowd did not cheer. It counted quietly to itself. From the river a barge came one morning with a cargo that did not fit. 4 crates of carved stone, fine worked, from the ruins of a Roynish outpost a zealot had chopped apart in his boredom 2 generations ago. They were sent by a man from Volantis who wished to flatter and to remind, and the archmaesters stood around the crates like cats who have been given a puzzle box by a lady. Rhaenys opened them because no one else could bear to begin. She lifted out a carved pillar that showed a river winding into a city. The river was called Mother in glyphs. No man there could read any longer. The piece was placed in the hall anyway. It made some men melancholy and made Visenya tap its base once, twice, and say, "Stone remembers ruin," which was not meant to be clever. At last, on a day bright enough to show dust, while not yet hot enough to oppress, the stewardship was made real. Not with trumpets, though there were trumpets, and not with banners, though the Hightower's great white sail made the wind into a story, but with a key. It was a key long and handsome, with a bow in the shape of a star, and a bit cut to matter only to the hand that turned it. Aegon held it, and then placed it in Manfred's palm, and said in a voice that carried in the way unshouted voices do, "This opens the granary named King's Bread. While I live, you hold it for me. When I am gone, your heir will hold it for my heir. If ever a Hightower locks that door against the realm, if ever a Hightower locks that door against the realm, as if it were his own, he will find he has turned his house into a..." Manfred's hands were steady. He bowed without bending too far, and answered in the words they had chosen together, and the words he had chosen alone. "We will be the hand that fetches, the hand that measures fair, the hand that hands a man his ration in winter. If we make a fist from that hand, may it wither." The High Septon's blessing was simple. He had learned simplicity from the dream. "What is given to keep is given to return," he said, and made a sign over the men before him. "If you keep what is not yours, it will break you. If you keep well, there will be enough." Aegon slept that night as men do when they have done a thing they feared and found no bolt waiting. In the morning, he rode out with Orys to look at a hillock 3 leagues upriver where he meant to put a small keep that would be his and not his host's. It would be an ugly place with thick walls and little comfort. A thing a soldier keeps for the day, he must be a soldier again. They drank from a skin and spat most of it out because the water was warm and a fly had wriggled in, and Orys, wiping his mouth, said, "You will make enemies for this that will not know how to show their teeth. They will not draw knives. They will write. They will not raise banners. They will count. They will hate you for putting the city between them and your ear." "Wando. I am not afraid of ink," Aegon said. "Then you are a rarer man than I," Orys replied. "Ink is a poison you do not taste until years later." On the way back, they passed a field where children were flying kites. The wind had its habits there, trained as men are trained, and lifted the paper and silk in honest curves. One had been shaped by a clever hand into something like a dragon. It turned and did not strike fear. Aegon smiled a little and did not quite know why. It is not to say that all approved. In a room with tall windows and the smell of dried mint, Archmaester Valen made a remark to Quillen about how kings are truest when they are far away from learned men, like sailors better when they sleep ashore. Quillen made a sour-humored noise and said, "We will find out together whether our learning shortens his arm or lengthens it." In another room, a young Hightower cousin counted out weights of silver for a contract, and thought what it would mean for a Hightower to be steward, when a Hightower was also given to wine. He was not thinking of the present lord, but of a cousin with a beautiful mouth and a weak spine. He wrapped the silver and the thought together and put them in a coffer. Rhaenys walked the maze of the lower city with a leather hood over her hair, and a servant only 20 paces behind. She liked to hear how a place talked when it did not think it was overheard. She bought figs in a paper twist and stood under a lintel to eat them while rain rattled tin. The woman who sold the figs had a son who had been trying to decide between the sept and the sea, and now was trying to decide if he might slightly prefer to serve in the steward's levy, because he liked the sound of the word and liked the way men were talking about the horns along the river. Rhaenys looked at the boy and thought only that his eyelashes made shadows on his cheek in the rain. That afternoon she sat with the High Septon in a quiet room, and asked him if the faith would forgive the king his hatching of a city in their shadow. The High Septon said, "We forgive kings nothing. We bless what we can bear, and we endure the rest and call our endurance holiness. Do not mistake those things." He did not smile. He pressed his fingers, old knuckles and all, to Rhaenys' hand for a moment. "But I dreamed," he added simply. "I dreamed of bread enough." The dragons took to basking on the black stone that erupted like an old scar through the Hightower's pale skin. Men told one another stories about that stone, the way men will do when something resists their chisel. Visenya would sometimes stand with her hand on it and feel nothing but chill and hardness. At other times there crept up her arm, no more than the idea of a tremor, as if somewhere below something turned its head. "There's a wrongness here," she said one evening by the parapet to Aegon, who had come because the wind moved, and he liked to be where the wind moved. "We should put a prayer on it or a weight. I do not want a hole in my house." "We will put men on it," Aegon said. "Men will do." It is easy to laugh at the idea that men can domesticate stone older than anything with hands. But men had made the city and the river obedient to their uses, had told the wind when to come in and when to go out, had put a song upon bells and a pattern upon light. Men are the only animal that will drag a stone into the light and ask it to be a step. The black stone would never be theirs. It would be a thing under a thing. But the keep Visenya wanted rose brick by brick within it, and the men who built it did not die in any more numbers than men die when they build honest walls. When autumn came, the river changed its voice, as if it had discovered a new consonant. The pears fell and were gathered in. The fish grew scarcer and dearer, and the first scouts from the Westerlands put their boots on the Hightower steps. They came with gold cut cleverly into jewelry that could be currency if one wished and ostentation if one did not. Behind them the lion walked in slower, padded steps, a son of Casterly Rock with a family mouth and a private dread of heights. He hid it well. He bowed correctly to the steward and incorrectly to the High Septon, and kept his eyes on Aegon's to avoid the windows. He had not thought much of Oldtown, up there in his stone, and now he saw that it was, no, not soft, nothing like a bed. Rather, it was the sort of seat a man takes when he means to stay. He was not sure if he liked men who stayed. He liked men who came to terms. They dined. The arbor gold was less beautiful when it met a Lannister's tongue, or perhaps it was more so. Conversation was the work and the amusement. Rhaenys asked him about bookbinders in Lannisport with a mild rain of questions. Visenya asked him how many spears 100 men might carry up an incline of a particular angle before their calves betrayed them. Aegon asked about smiths. The Lannister talked until he had talked too much, and then understood that he had said nothing they could not have guessed or known through other eyes. He went to bed in a room that seemed to move, not because the tower swayed, but because the river did, and it got into a man's gut. He woke in the dark to the sound of the beacon's fuel being hauled, heard the slap of the men's feet and the grunt of effort, and thought, they intend to keep this place lit even in moonless nights. He was not sure if he admired this or feared it. The city learned the king's habits with the quick greed of any companion that wants to serve and to profit. The vintners discovered he liked their wine tart when the evening had been long with policy. The baker near the Bridge of Voices learned to keep a small loaf aside for him to eat when he rode out in damp mornings. The bell ringers learned he preferred the third-hour bell a little off, for its imperfection made him notice time instead of ignoring it. The men in the counting rooms learned nothing about his tastes and much about his signatures. It is an intimacy, the steady witness of a hand upon paper. On a winter morning, when the light came in thin and left early, Aegon stood alone in the starry sept, for even kings get to be alone in holy places sometimes. The dome was a night made of day and oil. He looked up until his neck hurt, the way a child looks up, and he thought of the hour he had set foot at the mouth of the Blackwater, of the feeling that came when a thing you have decided becomes a thing that is happening, forever different from both thought and aftermath. The gods were quiet, and he found himself oddly comforted by their silence. He did not want a god who talked at him like a woman at a window. He wanted a god that would see and not stop him if he did not deserve to be stopped. Footsteps in the nave. He did not turn. He knew the gate. Rhaenys came and stood beside him and put her hand into the crook of his elbow, and neither spoke for a time, because the oil had a smell, and the place had a shape against the soul. At last she said very lightly, "We will need a word for what we are making." "Kingdom," he said. "Kingdom is a word for a promise," she returned. "We are making the keeping of one." They walked out together in air that stung. On Battle Isle, men were carrying in new timbers for the storehouse Visenya had wanted. A boy stumbled and was caught before he broke his head. The Hightower's banner took the wind and cracked like a whip, and Rhaenys laughed because she liked the sound. Aegon stopped at the parapet where the black stone came through and put his palm to it. It was very cold. He stood with his hand there long enough to feel the ache, and then he took it away. He looked out over Oldtown. The river was a long thought. Smoke rose in thin, pure lines. The dragons were visible, one as a fat stroke of darkness on the far quay, one a small curve of white laid out along sun-warmed stone, one not seen because she was higher than eye like to go without making itself dizzy. He did not know the names of half the men whose lives he was altering, and that troubled him less than it ought. A king cannot know every name, but he knew the name he had given to a house. Steward. He had put a key into a hand and said, "Keep what is not yours for those to whom it belongs." He had asked a city to bear him with its old bones. He felt the ache in his palm grow warmer and then fade, and thought, "This is where we will learn to stay." In the night, a storm came in from the whispering sound. It took hold of the tower and shook it the way a friend does when he thinks you are being ridiculous. Men turned in their beds, and a woman woke and pulled her child closer, and then forgot the fear because the rhythm soothed. The beacon burned. Each time the flame dipped, someone made sure it rose again. Aegon slept and saw nothing except, for a moment, as if it had been placed in his head like a coin on a tongue, a picture of a hall built to the black stones, odd line, and made handsome by use. In his dream, there were shelves of ledgers, and a boy with ink on his fingers, and a woman whose chain had more pewter than silver, making a point about the price of oats. He woke smiling, and then stopped, because a king should not be charmed by oats. He got up and dressed in the dark, and went to the window, and smelled the storm and the city under it, and the thin keen of a dragon like a whetstone in the wind, and he was, for a very private moment, glad. In the years to come, men would say he made himself small in Oldtown, and thus made the realm large, or that he hid under the skirts of the faith to make himself holy, or that he put the citadel at his shoulder because he did not trust his sword. Men like to find one verb for a life. The city did not bother. It learned his step and put his wishes into law where it could, and turned them into market where it could not. It gossiped in his ear with bells and barges, and wrote him long love letters in the form of gray, careful books. It asked him for three things in return: that he keep the granaries honest, that he keep the horns honest, that he keep himself, as much as a man may, honest. The Hightower glowed through fog. The beacon's light was the same as it had been, but different when you walked away from it, because you carried in you that key-shaped vow. When Lord Manfred died in a winter that cracked ice all the way down to the riverbed, his son took the key with hands chapped and cracked and said the words again. He did not have his father's mouth, but he had the habit of care, and that was enough. When a Lannister son sat in the hall and learned to count the price of a good city to his pride, he went away with a distaste for the smell of fish and a grudging respect. When the Dornish woman with sand in her hair came for figs, she looked up and saw a dragon and flared her nostrils and still bought the fruit, because the day does not stop for old wars. One evening, late, Aegon sat with Ores by an open brazier and drank wine that had gone darker with the season. There were papers on the table and ash on the flagstones and the sound of men laughing somewhere down the corridor. He said, "Do you remember the camp by the Blackwater? How the wind cut and took from you what it could?" "Mendero." Ores leaned back and stuck his booted foot toward the brazier until it was too warm and then pulled it back. "I remember," he said. "It made a man mean and honest. This place makes a man comfortable and honest." "I prefer comfortable." Aegon smiled. "Do you?" "For now," Ores said. "We will have to leave it," Aegon said then, not sour but stipulating. "We will have to ride. There are places that will not bend because there is food and a bell. We will have to break something again, and then come back, and then go, and come back." He poured more wine and did not drink it. "But when we come back, it will be to something that kept." "Stewards," Ores said, as if naming a prayer. Aegon looked at the brazier until the coals went from orange to the wine color, and he thought of a boy with ink on his fingers, a girl selling figs, a man carrying a pitch bucket and a horn sounding and a key in a winter hand. He thought of a word Rhaenys had wanted for what they were making. "Kingdom," he had said. "Keeping," she had said. They are the same word in some mouths. Outside, the river took its measure of the city and gave back light. Balerion, not sleeping, moved his head where he lay and blew out a breath like a bellows. Somewhere across the Hightower, Vhagar stirred and settled again with a sound like a book closing. The storm had gone. The stillness that followed storms is not an absence of sound. It is a full, big quiet that sets every other sound into a clearer shape. It made a shape around a man at his window, hands on stone, thinking of roofs. It made a shape around a city that would, in its fashion, keep him. Oh, Kai. For a long while, the days after the key changed nothing and everything at once. Men still lined to buy bread in the first chill hour. Boats bumped the quays and broke the day's surface into small bright pieces. The bells threaded the hours through the city's cloth. But beneath that quiet, there moved a new rhythm. Like an extra drum in the marching band, a beat that told hands where to fetch and feet where to go in winter. The steward's men kept a tally at the king's bread granary with charcoal and a wetted sponge, and a boy with ink-stained fingers began to learn what it meant to swear by a measure instead of a man's smile. The steward's codex thickened. At first it was all harvest and river and horn. Then it began to grow edges. A rule about the watchman's hours. No man to hold a lantern more than 4 on a stretch. No man to keep his post without warm broth in the second. Read next to a decree that every barrel of oil for the beacon would be weighed and countersigned by a Hightower cousin and a crown man of the hand's choosing. That was how work got done between houses that wished to love and did not always trust the way the other bent at doorways. In the margins, the archmaesters fought, fierce in small script, over what a steward might bar without being called a tyrant. "He may close any quay during riot," wrote Theomore, to which Valen added, "Define riot and Quillen." Grumbling and Careful wrote, "Rumbling and Careful wrote, Rumbling and Careful wrote, no law you do not mean to keep when the blood threshes between your..." It was not only in ink. The horns along the Honeywine went up one by one, posts sunk deep, copper mouths polished like altar bowls. Men tuned them to the city like the way a singer will find the key of a hall with her throat. One long call poured along the water like warm oil, the next cut sharp enough to make a man drop a rope. The first time they were tried all together, it was for false fear. Children on the Bridge of Voices had set a rag to smoldering and then ran, aghast at their own courage. The horns answered one another in a chain of sound. and the city moved. Hooks, buckets, the steward's cart loaded with sand, men's feet that had learned what to do before their heads did, and by the time the rag had burned itself into a curl, the corner was blackened, and there were 100 people breathing fast and laughing at nothing, as men do after panic. Visenya stood above them and watched what she had made in men rather than in stone. She allowed herself 3 breaths of satisfaction and then went back with a mason to look at a stanchion she thought would take water badly in a flood. Sometimes Aegon felt his life was a sequence of tables. He sat at them until dark, quill in hand, while Orys worried a bit of wax between thumb and forefinger and glared at letters as if they were disobedient squires. He sat with the Hightower's son, Garmon now, with the winter at Manfred's back already foreseen and prepared for, over a chart that showed the lower city as a net of lines, each line a promise to have lanterns set at nightfall. He sat with the High Septon and 3 of his gods sworn. The warriors' sons wore steel openly in Oldtown, for there was no pretense here that the mothers should bless men without the father's mailed hand near to keep them. About who would keep order around the Sept's fairs. "If you ask me to lay down arms in the city where the father's voice is loudest," said the grand captain of the warriors' sons. A gray-haired man with a scar that puckered his cheek so he always looked on the edge of a smile. "You ask me to be Herod in Bethlehem. I ask you to remember that a sword raised in zeal cuts the wrong man often." Aegon returned without flinch. "I ask you to see that I have given a key to a keeper, for bread enough that men will not need to steal a crust, and send your zeal to fetch them home. I ask you to say in the hearing of all that in the Hightower wards, while the beacon is tended and the horns kept clear, no man will draw steel without the steward's leave, not even a man with stars on his cloak. Between the bells, we will not draw blood." "Men, the warriors' sons," the grand captain said after a moment, "are not boys. We have our pride. So do bards and bakers," Orys said pleasantly from Aegon's left. "Pride is cheaper than bread and more expensive than peace. Find a way to use yours that makes my supper quieter." Menderamsho. The High Septon's palm made a bridge of calm across the table's air. "If we are to bless this marriage of city and crown," he said, "let each keep one room where the other takes off his boots and does not meddle. The Hightower's wards and the king's bread, the starry sept precinct and the poorhouse lanes. Each voice loud where it must be, softened where it ought." They called it nothing formal in that hour, because men do not always know when they are making a thing that will be remembered by name. Later, scribes would call it the Oldtown Concord, and write handsome letters about how it saved 3 riots and prevented 1,000 small wounds. In the room itself, it was only letting breath go and signing your name with a little more pressure than before. Visenya scratched her mark with finality and stood. Rhaenys, who had said little, poured wine with a kind of grateful concentration, like a woman watering a plant she loves that is finally out of danger. Outside that sort of room, the city tried on the idea of a court, the way a child tries a cloak, buckling the wrong strap first, smirking, then suddenly quiet when he realizes it is truly his to wear. A harpist from the Mander who could make a song like a river's traveling set the hall's air to a silver-threaded hush that drew men reluctant and held them longer than they thought they liked. A cook from a booth near the Ender's Dock was hired to teach the palace boys to make almond paste with orange blossom water until it yielded. The boy with ink-stained fingers grew into a youth with calm hands and began to carry his chain's first link. The pewter that says, "I am learning to learn." Rhaenys asked him once, not unkindly, how he had come to the citadel, and he told her of a father who died in a boat and a mother who kept a stall selling thread and trinkets, and how the sound of bells had always comforted him. "They tell you the day is not slipping away without notice," he said, and she put a hand on his sleeve and thought, "You and I are doing the same work in different clothing." Envoys kept coming. The Iron Islands sent a lean man with palms roughened like rope. He wore no gold, and a piece of driftwood about his neck. Hung on a leather thong. He said, "The whores burned. We voted a Greyjoy to be our lord. We will not be kings if you do not ask it of us. That last carried a flavor of pride on the edges, because a man must find it somewhere. Aegon's look did not flinch. "I will not ask it of you," he said. "You will be Lord Paramount of the Iron Islands, and keep your writ upon the isles. Your writ ends when men can stand on sand and hear the river's birds. If ever again an Ironborn puts his torch to a river town, the king's bread will not feed his wife when she comes starving to the quay." He had learned to speak in provisions and punishments that touched women and children gently, and men with care's rough hand. The envoy went away with salt on his face that could have been spray, or could have been tears, and with a letter bearing the seal of a king who had chosen to make a door where there could have been a wall. From the eyrie there arrived a boy's laughter. It came on velvet with a mother's kiss beside it. The errands had bent, and Ronald had ridden Vagar at his asking under the stern, private smile at Visenya's mouth. The letter with the moon and falcon seal mentioned that he still talked of wings in his sleep. It was a thing to keep, the knowledge that a child had found joy without blood to buy it. Visenya read it and did not smile exactly. She tucked the letter away inside a piece of armor where only she kept such tokens, as if joy were a morsel a soldier might take out and rub between finger and thumb in a cold camp, and so keep the feeling from wearing entirely away. The Lannister son returned to Casterly Rock and wrote in a private letter that the city made a noise he could not stop hearing, that it breathed through the night like a creature he could not best, and that the king had learned to write laws that were harder to draw swords against without seeming a boor. Loren sent another son, older and less afraid of heights, who took a great interest in granary locks. He toured King's Bread with the Hightowers steward at his side, nodding as if at old friends. "A lock keeps out the man who wants to get in without right," he said to Garmin. "But it also keeps out the man who wants to bring help if the key is lost." Garmin made a noise that said, "I hear you, Lion, and I will decide later whether I find you a teacher or a nuisance." Harlan Tyrell sent a poem to Rhaenys bound up with pears, and if he meant to flatter, he had chosen a better instrument than wine. She sent him back a song she had heard Amanda Harper sing, written out in her sloped hand, and a small, perfect knife made for peeling fruit. The Reach and its lords had their own pride. The city did not ask them to give it up. It asked them to set it in a different cupboard. The watch was named without much thought, because names sometimes leap out of mouths before a man has time to consider whether he wanted it. A watchman, pinning a lantern badge to his chest, a simple piece of tin that shone when it caught the right light, said proudly to his wife, "I'm a lantern man now," and in 2 days boys were running around the lanes with corks on strings calling each other that, and in 4 the armorer asked the steward scribe if he wanted the badge to be a lantern, or a star, or both. They settled on a star within a lantern, and a Hightower cousin with a neat turn of mind had them cut into bronze for the senior men. It pleased the eye to see them in a line at dusk. A ribbon of light up the Honeywine Lane. Aegon took to riding out with 2 of the lantern men at dawn on certain days, when he wanted to look at roofs, without being presented to by every baker who ever learned to bow. He learned the smells of the city in those hours better than any time. Fish and yeast and river and old wood, and the sweet scent of a fig bruised in a child's pocket. He saw a woman beating a rug on a parapet, and he thought of banners, and it all conspired to make him feel the world was more practical than any dream of it. The lantern men were proud to know him in that fashion. He had a way of speaking to commoners that was neither false plainness nor far courtesy. He asked men questions as if they were tools he meant to keep sharp. It was not charm, though men might have called it that. It was attention harnessed to will. Visenya spent less time in the lanes and more on the walls. She established a roster of men who would sleep in their boots and always smell slightly of pitch, and paid them well and was hard on them. She took her dragon up and over the river in slow, thoughtful loops, as if she might teach Vagar the city's voices as well as the men. In the keep within the fused black stone's embrace, the ugly place she had wanted, brick set like a stubborn mouth inside a scar, she had a chamber stripped bare of finery and a table in it, with pegs along each side. The pegs were for ropes that, when pulled, sounded a horn, or raised a shutter, or signaled a watch change 3 streets away, when the storm thumped the tower and the beacon smoked. She had men down there at the ropes practicing until their forearms burned. No one praised her for this. Men do not often praise the things that keep them alive. She did not care about praise. Rhaenys made a court. She did not call it that. She invited in singers and children and cooks and the old men who know the names of stars, and the better sort of whore, the kind whose conversation cooks more slowly than her work, and leaves a man with the idea that he has been understood. She put ladies who were not born to lords' houses into rooms with windows, and asked them to embroider cushions with ships on them. And the ships were done with love, because in Oldtown ships are a kind of shrine, the way in the North men carve faces in trees. She took the boy with the pewter link to the beacon to show him how the men hauled up oil, and he wept without embarrassment, and then wrote a line about it in a hand too large that made a maester shake his head and love him. In the second autumn, a fever crept along the wharves like a thief. It licked at children, and then at men who slept in damp bedding, and then at some of the lantern men who had kept to the rainy hours too long without dry socks. The bells changed their register and brought men to doors where women waited with vinegar and rags. The Hightower opened a lower hall for the sickest. The High Septon sent sisters who knew that a warm cloth is sometimes holy as any sacrament. A rumor bubbled that the king's bread had been tainted by an enemy. That would have taken 3 nights to swell if it had been left to the lanes to do the swelling. Oris walked to the square at the Ender's Dock and spoke before men had eaten their supper. If there is taint, it is the taint of your children's hands, you who do not keep their blankets dry, he said. And then, before that could be heard as cruelty, the steward's carts will carry dry wool and soap to each lane. The king will pay for it out of the money he meant to spend on a new saddle. Wash your children's hands. He did not smile. He made the work unromantic. Men listened and fought with their wives and did as they were told. The fever burned itself and went. 3 lantern men were buried with the sort of honor that laces grief into something a city can wear without tearing. By then the roadworks had begun. It is a silly word, a small one, for the great swing of labor that moves across land like a plow and leaves a thing behind men who will use for 100 years. The road from Oldtown to Bitterbridge and then on to Highgarden fattened like a well-fed dog. Carts rolled smoother, and the king began to talk in miles as if counting cloaks in a chest. He commissioned a line toward the west, not to supplant the ocean road to Lannisport. Men would always love sea avenues best when they could, but to give an army a spine inland. Northward, he could not have a king's road like the one a later king would build from the Blackwater up through the neck, for the city's heart pulsed now from a different rib. But he could make a rose-rat and another, unnamed thing through Tumbleton that carried horses and provisions alike. The Hightower contracted carters. Tyrell sent laborers because it made him a part of it. The Citadel took an interest in a bridge and sent a young archmaester with hands that smelled of vellum to stand with masons and learn that stone has ideas too. There were nights when Aegon looked over the honey wine and felt something like shyness in his own chest, an emotion he had not known since he was a boy being caught out in some small lie in Dragonstone's cold halls. He felt it when the High Septon preached a sermon not about kings and not about conquest but about keepers, and the word fell like rain across the nave and he heard the echo in the city's talk later. The way a thing said well survives in mouths. He felt it when he watched Manfred's hand shake a little as he set the key in the lock on a day of ice. And he put his hand under the old lord's elbow without making a gesture of it, and the two of them stood, one strong and one less so, and it felt like a verse that rhymed without making a show of rhyme. Letters from Dragonstone had a different smell when they were opened. Saltier, colder, as if the wind that chased the ink up the page had not warmed. Visenya kept that airy, as promised. There are some places where a certain sort of thinking sits easier on a woman's bones than others. From there, she flew to the Vale once again and checked that the pass was a pass, and not a path an enemy had made bad manners into inevitability. She flew to Crackclaw Point and watched men with small boats and large hearts go into the tide, and thought how often the realm would need that kind of courage to keep itself. She did not fly to Dorne. It was not fear. It was a kind of waiting. Rhaenys did fly. Men will say different things about why a woman goes where she goes. She went because her curiosity is a tinder that could catch from the faintest spark. She went because Miria had sent limes, and the tongue does not forget. She went because her dreams had a geometry she could not square without that country's angles in it. She went first not to Sunspear, where politics are bred like cats, but to the Greenblood's slow braid, where the orphans half sang as they pulled their boats. She flew low enough that the children laughed and pointed, and Merax's shadow stitched the river into two colors in a way that made even the old men look up and make signs against envy. She landed at Ghost Hill, where an old knight, whose bones were all but sand, met her with a bow that came from a time when the Martells and the Yronwoods did not share even a god. "You will not find us in livery to the Lion or the Rose," he said, with pride that had turned itself into courtesy. "You will find us in our own house." She did not quarrel. She sat and ate pomegranates, and listened to stories that sometimes contradicted themselves in the space of a single sentence, and never flagged for that. She asked a girl to show her how the linen was bleached to that particular clean white under sun, that did not always look like harmless coins but sometimes like knives. She flew to Skyreach and learned what wind was like when it had spent itself climbing stone. She went last to Sunspear, because every tale wanted her there at the end, like a play that knows where its curtain must fall. Miria Martell received her in a beer-sweet hall, with a painting of Nymeria on one wall, so old its colors remembered ochre, on their own. Miria's eyes were a poor woman's and a queen's at once, their corners painted by living. "You did not write," she said to Rhaenys, with a smile that revealed all of her teeth. "And yet here you are with your big girl." "I do not write as well as the songs your people make," Rhaenys returned. "I am better at listening." "Are you?" Miria drew a hand across her brow, as if the sun had been troublesome, and then shrugged and laughed at the gesture. "The Reach woman in you has been eating figs," she said. "You smell of them. Will you smell of us when you fly home?" Rhaenys did not look away. "I will smell of dust and limes," she said honestly, "and of a river that does not want to be anything but itself. Then we will have done well enough with you if you carry the scent of what we are, and not what you wanted to make us." Miria lifted a lime from a bowl and rolled it between her palms, as if she were warming a ball of dough. "We will not be yours without purpose. We will not be the lion's shield or the rose's footstool. If you ride down on us and burn and take, you will keep men who lie down to sleep imagining knives. If you let us sleep as we wish, you will keep men imagining songs. Both kinds can keep you at night. Choose." "Now." Rhaenys thought of Aegon's hand upon fused stone. She thought of Visenia's pegs and ropes. She thought of the boy with ink on his fingers writing too large. She thought of bells. "My husband builds a keep inside a wound," she said, half to herself. "And do you call us a wound?" Miria asked with obvious delight. "I call you a place where my husband's dreams do not fit yet," Rhaenys answered. "And a place where mine will not be quiet until I measure them against your light." They talked until the light turned thin and long, and took on that gray that belongs only to sun that is leaving. In one place, their words touched hot. About the faith, about the lords who think a man's bed is their business, and a woman's body is a field for their law, and their Rhaenys did not try to mend anything. She took her leave with the formal courtesies the Martell women keep like knives kept very clean, and she flew north over broken country, where the wind had learned newer, rougher songs. When she reached Oldtown again at dawn, she smelled of dust and limes and river. Aegon kissed her and tasted all of it, and did not ask for her reasoning yet. He had learned from her that a thought left to ripen can turn sweeter. In the same season, a small rebellion brewed near Tumbleton. Not a rebellion truly, only some men with more horses than sense, and a grudge tangled like old nettles. They refused a watch tax, seized a granary wagon, hit a lantern man with a stone and ran when his fellow cut the corner on them with a boat hook. It was foolish, but foolishness spreads like a stain when men are in their cups with old indignations. Orys went with a file of crown men and 2 companies of Hightower spearmen, keeping the banner low to make the work prosaic rather than heroic. He found the men in a barn and spoke to them like oxen, clear, kind, firm. And when they threw the first panic punch, he broke 3 noses and knocked 1 man cold, and had the rest counting their own teeth for the luxury of it. On the ride back, he held up the stone that had struck the lantern man. "This," he said to Aegon later, in the hall where the pewter-linked boy had fallen asleep over a page, and his mouth was slightly open, "is the size of the kingdom's problems now when it comes to the Reach. not mountains. Stones, die they. And if we can keep them that size, we will die in our beds. Then, do you want that? Aegon asked him. Yes, Orys said, with such certainty that the word took the sting out of any other possible answer. I have slept on the ground enough times to admire sheets. Let me die in mine with a woman making fun of my snoring. Aegon laughed so quietly the sound hardly set the candlelight to moving. We will have to leave them, he said, echoing himself without knowing it. The stones will grow in other places. You cannot hold all of a country at once in your 2 hands, Orys said. You can show it how to hold itself. You have begun. The maesters framed their pages in a larger hand now, sat in long rooms with reeds and arguments, and wrote about granaries as if they were battles. The High Septon preached 3 homilies on the sins of mismeasurement, and the last of these had 3 jokes so good even men who disliked jokes within holy walls grinned into their sleeves. The Hightower's niece married a steward of the citadel who always smelled faintly of glue, and the wedding bread had a star pressed into it with a signet, and the city ate and wept and danced in a way that showed it had learned to wear its joy without looking at who watched. One afternoon, resin thick and hot, Aegon walked alone down to the quay, where the tide was going out against the stubborn river, and all the boats had to be encouraged rather than merely permitted to go where they meant. A girl sat with her bare feet in the water, kicking against the pull, and her mother called to her in a voice that was half annoyance and half relief, because no woman who has ever seen the water take a love thing wants to see it again. Aegon leaned on a piling and watched and smelled pitch and sun on wood, and heard a bell answer another a mile away. He thought, absurdly and completely sincerely, "This is my crown." Visenya came down later and stood beside him and said, "If we put more men at the mouth of the river, we will keep thieves from slipping through at dusk." "If we put more men, the river will be uglier at dusk," he answered, and she made a face and let the argument rest for a day. They had learned to do that too, not to decide everything at once, not to make a strength a vice by using it in every room. Nothing in Oldtown drives quickly toward tragedy, because the city's habit is continuance. So when the first hint of the war with Dorne slid under the door like a draft, it did not turn the candles out at once. A Dornish captain, more ardent than wise, raided a Marcher village and took 3 boys who should have been left to their mothers. A Marcher lord, more proud than wise, pursued into country he did not know and lost men he could not replace. Word ran along the roads that had been fattened by the king's purpose and reached Aegon while he was listening to a man argue for wider barges. He folded the request in half and set it by his hand. He looked for Rhaenys. "Soon," she said as if answering another question. Her eyes had the distant, bright look they wore when she had flown too long and needed a different sky. And yet there were 3 other matters in that week that asked. Not begged, not screamed, only asked. To be seen. A dispute between 2 guilds about the width of carts. A proposal to set a small mintage in Oldtown so coins need not all come from Lannisport with lions' faces on them. A letter from Grafton's man in Gulltown about a fishery whose rights dated back to a lord no living man could remember. The city crowded in and made itself plain. You cannot make an empire out of one story. "Stewards keep," Aegon said aloud that night, to no one in particular, and smiled because he liked the way the words felt in his mouth. He could see what he had made beginning to learn to live without his hand in every small task, as a child must learn to cut his own meat. He could leave. He could go burn something that needed burning. He could come back. He did not go at once. He sent Orys south with Stormlanders first, to press the Marchers into shape, and sew up holes where men loved a fight better than a field. Visenya wrote a letter to the Grand Captain of the Warrior's Sons. "Keep the precinct," she said. "Do not prowl. Remove vagrants kindly, and do not raise your voice unless you mean to draw steel. And if you draw steel, the steward will take your measure afterward." The Grand Captain wrote back a letter full of scripture and a little honest annoyance. Men whose lives are made into symbols do not always enjoy being told where to put their boots. But he did, as she asked. The lantern men stood the dusk watch with a certain swagger that can grade if not properly earned. They had earned it. They kept their lanterns lit and their mouths shut, except to call warnings, and the city moved as if its joints had been greased. Aegon rode out one last morning along the quay. The fog had come in, not thick enough to hide dragons, but enough to turn the Hightower into a thing partly guessed. He stopped at the end of the stone where the black underlayer made itself felt in the soles of a man's feet if he stood long enough, and he put his palm down just as he had on nights when the wind made him think too much. It was so cold it hurt. He left it there until the stone was, if not warm, at least no longer an insult. And when he took his hand away, there were faint, ridiculous prints of his skin for a breath of time before the air ate them. Rhaenys came and set her palm where his had been. Her skin was warmer than his. "When I'm gone," she said, with that same casualness she could bring to a sentence that would echo for years. "Keep them from turning love into law." "Which them?" he asked, genuinely curious, because she had that habit of turning pronouns into puzzles you learn from if you solve them. "All of them," she said, and smiled. And then was a step away, and then mounted, and then a long arc up into the air on Merax's back so clean it made the breath catch in his throat, as it had the first time he had ever watched her fly. The dragon's shadow put a bruise on the water that healed by itself when the wings had passed. Aegon did not imagine tragedy then. That is the trick tragedy plays. It allows you calm before it does its worst. He imagined only heat and sand and Miria's laughter and the way Rhaenys' hair would smell when she came back, and he let himself think of a feast for returning riders and a song from the green blood and a child in the square who would point and say, I saw her with my eyes." He imagined his own work as a steady flame that would still be burning when she came to sit by it and rest her hands. That night the bells made an odd harmony that set the dogs to howling on one stretch of quay and left the lantern men with their heads cocked like birds listening under a hedge. The beacon burned through fog like a principle a man could hold in his bare hands. Somewhere below the Hightower, in the ugly keep sunk within the fused stone, a man pulled a rope and a shutter went up, and a horn sounded a note almost too low to hear, more felt than known. Garmon Hightower slept in a chair with the key set on the table by his hand, because he had been counting casks and was too weary to walk to his bed. The pewter-link boy dreamed he was counting stars and losing track, and then finding them in a different order that still made a pattern. The High Septon woke and did not know why and went to stand by a window and whisper a name he did not quite speak. In the morning, there would be letters from the Marches and a mason with a complaint about the width of a doorway and a singer with a tune he insisted was new, though Rhaenys would know it was only a clever old thing with a different step. There would be the river's voice like a big animal a man can live with. There would be a king who had taught his hands to keep and made a city into a thing that held even when a dragon left its shadow elsewhere. The realm breathed in its sleep. The Hightower's light climbed the braid of fog like a prayer. A man had learned so well he could say it even in falling. On the third day, the weather broke and sunshine laid a clean blade along the water. Aegon stood in the starry sept again, alone at first, then with two lantern men halfway back because they had learned where they could be without turning quiet into spectacle. He looked up into the painted night and, without embarrassed piety, asked that the keeping he had made be strong enough to hold even when his own hand was far. He asked, with a kind of private joking honesty, that men take their measures fairly, and that the man who cleaned the beacon's wick not grow careless because no one praised him. He asked nothing of glory. He had burned enough for glory. He wanted roofs. He wanted bread. He wanted a city to keep breathing with or without him. The answer was only the echo of his own feet as he walked back across the stones and into the day. The city had no time to wait for a god. A cart stalled in a narrow lane, and 4 boys shouted advice, and a man with a mule shook his head and smiled, and found that he liked the feeling of patience in his chest. Bells braided the hour. Balerion turned in his sleep on the Hightower's lower stones, and exhaled a wind that smelled faintly of hot iron and old caves. A rider came in at last with dust on his eyelashes. He did not bring a storm behind him. He brought a change in the day's light that the eye might not even name. He flung himself down and was nearly too weary to kneel, and then remembered himself and knelt so abruptly his knee banged stone. Aegon put a hand under his arm before he could speak. "There are words that will salt themselves as they come," and he wanted to give the messenger enough water to carry them. The man whispered. He was not dramatic. He simply breathed the words as if saying them aloud might break them into smaller, less harmful pieces. Aegon listened once, twice, a third time. He had him say the place again, and the way of the wind, and whether the dragon had cried. When the man had finished with the facts, when all the small nails had been tapped in to hold the thing to the wall of the world, Aegon stood very straight and closed his eyes and opened them and said, "Find Orys, find Visenya." His voice did not break. A man's habit will keep him longer than grief sometimes. Oldtown did not know for 3 more hours. It went on setting out its bowls and making its bargains and sweeping its stoops because that is what cities do, while kings rearranged the time behind closed doors. When it knew, when the bells spoke in a chord that had not sounded since the day of the king's anointing, an old note of blessing bent into something like loss. It stopped and wept in the way human places weep, privately at shutters, with flour on hands and pitch on boots, with curses for a world that takes beautiful things, admiration for the beautiful thing it had taken. Men loved Rhaenys in a way they did not love other great ones, because she had asked them for songs and laughter, and not just blood. The women loved her because she had made space for their cleverness at court, and because she had smelled of figs when she leaned over a cradle, and because she had laughed in a lane and not made the lane feel ashamed to be itself. Visenya came with her mouth a line cut deeper than any line on her mail. Orys came with his jaw set to punish work. Aegon came with a face that would never again be the face he had when he put a key in a steward's hand and thought only of bread. They did not speak in public. They went to the ugly keep sunk inside the black stone and laid out a map, and Visenya's hand made 3 small marks that no man wanted to see. "Not there," Orys said through his teeth, as if a denial could change stone. "There," she said, and put the weight of her finger upon it. He bowed his head and looked at the nails half-moon on parchment for a long moment, because he was a man and sometimes a man needs something small to look at when the large thing is too much. The High Septon came. He did not bless anything. He stood with them and put his hand on Aegon's shoulder and said, "Very plain, we will keep." He did not mean the faith. He meant the city. He meant the work. He meant the key and the horns and the lantern men. He meant the roof. Aegon bowed his head once, not to God, not to the man, but to the plain fact that the keeping matters more when the beautiful thing is gone. In the days that followed, the Oldtown concord did not break. It held. The lantern men kept the dusk. The beacon burned. The king's bread was weighed and weighed again, because men eat even when great ones die, and somehow it was a comfort to count and write and stamp and sign. The Hightower's hall received men with dry eyes and wet sleeves. Tyrell's letter came with a ribbon and with nothing that looked like a rose except restraint. Lauren's man sent a blank sheet because sometimes a blank sheet is as eloquent as any paragraph. The Ironborn sent fish and a very short note. "We have women too," it said, and even Orys's scowl softened a notch at the blunt, good-hearted attempt. The orphans of the Greenblood floated down to the river's mouth in their long, low boats and sang, as if a song could draw a woman back along the wind's spine. It could not. The song found other uses. Aegon did a foolish thing by some measures, and a true thing by others. He walked alone a while in the lanes at dusk. Not far, and not without 2 lantern men shadowing him at a distance, but alone enough that he could hear the small sound of hearths settling and the bell's long release over water. He put his hand upon doorposts, the way a man sometimes does when leaving or returning, as if to mark himself present to the house, and no one stopped him because grief sometimes gives a privacy that no title can. He came at last to the granary and set his palm on the door as if greeting an old friend. Garmon Hightower stepped from the shadow with the key in his hand and did not speak. He held out the iron. Aegon did not take it. He only touched it, light as if he feared to burn himself. And then he lifted his hand and set it on Garmon's shoulder, and the 2 of them looked at the door until the lantern outside smoked and needed trimming. When he rode out days later with Orys and Visenya, and an army that moved with the sound of many feet taught to agree, Oldtown stood on its walls and did not cheer. It did not wave ribbons. It watched, and it kept. The dragons passed over, and the shadow fell and healed itself. And the city made the low, continuous sound of a beast breathing. The beacon burned. The horns were quiet. The Hightower's light cut the morning into manageable pieces for the men who had to live in it. The maesters argued about whether the codex should include a line about mourning and decided, sensibly, that grief will take its own place, whether a book makes room for it or not. On the quay, a girl sat with her feet in the water, and her mother called her back, and she went, laughing, because the day did not end for her. In the starry sept, the High Septon hung a thin veil of silver thread over the place where a prayer for safe return is kept, and then took it down again because he thought God knows plain words best. In the ugly keep, a man pulled a rope, and a shutter went up because practice is a prayer too. The road lay ahead, long and bright, and then dusty, and then hot with things that would blister a man's hands and his heart. Behind, the city held the shape they had made together, not perfect, not holy in any way a pious man would claim, but sufficient. A granary locked and opened, a lantern lit and trimmed, a horn that when blown would wake men who had taught themselves to wake easily. Even as the wagons vanished into the country's green, and then its pale, the Honeywine carried small boats up and down with cabbages and gossip, and the bells knitted another hour. The keeping did not wait for anyone's permission. It was a nature now, as much as tide. When dusk came, a boy with a pewter link set his quill down and stretched his cramped fingers and went up to the Hightower's lower parapet to watch the day end. He had loved Rhaenys as boys love a queen who sees them, and now he loved her in a quieter way, as a man loves a memory that has set some new habit in him. He listened. The city made its enormous hush, and then, in it, a small sound. Someone laughing, someone crying, a lantern glass being cleaned with a careful cloth. He thought of the first morning on the cloister, when he had seen dragons come like hills with wings. He thought of limes and figs, and the taste of oil smoke on his tongue when he had stood too near the beacon. He thought of the king's hand on a door and the steward's hand on a key, and the weight of those two. Equal as grammar? He thought, unashamed. A prayer that was also a promise. We will keep. The river turned its black silver and carried the moon's long face in it, making a coin so thin a man could not spend it on anything but his own courage. The Hightower's lantern lifted. Somewhere, above sight, a dragon went from shadow into stars.